Great to be here with everyone. Thank you so much for having me. So I'm a professor over at UMBC, but we're affiliated with the School of Social Work downtown, and Jenny is one of the doctoral students downtown, and Rob is here on the line with me today. So I wanted to walk you through an activity that the three of us presented at or developed kind of together, and I used in my class last semester because I thought it was pretty helpful and really engaged students in conversation. So I'm just going to kind of walk you through it. So what I want to do today is demonstrate what we did in the classroom in hopes that it's something that you all can then take and replicate in your classes. And we'll talk a little bit at the end about how maybe to adapt it for other schools that aren't necessarily social work, although I do see a handful of social work colleagues on the line, so that's great. So what are the objectives of the classroom activity? When I do this, what am I hoping to accomplish? First, for students to understand a policy, and in particular here, we're talking about a bill, a policy that's been proposed, therefore is in the media, is of concern to us, but is not yet passed. Then we'll use the Code of Ethics, and I'll briefly explain to you what the Code of Ethics is for anyone who's not so familiar. How to use it as a framework to analyze policy, right? How do we use this as the lens at which we look at a policy and decide whether or not it's a good policy, something we want to stand behind? And then we're really looking for students to, in the virtual world, in a synchronous classroom, to work as a team, to have a discussion, to brainstorm, to kind of think about how this impacts our clients. So for anyone who's not aware, the Code of Ethics for social work is broken down into two main sections. And Rob will put the link there in the chat. So if anyone wants to open it, you can actually see our Code of Ethics. But basically the first part is these 6 values that we say kind of defines the way that we look at the world, right? So these are 6 different values: service, social justice, dignity and worth of the person, importance of human relationships, integrity, and competence. And so I'll talk about those a little bit more later, because these are the ones that we use in the activity today. But the Code of Ethics then goes on and includes a little bit more. So it talks about how we use ethics and what our responsibilities are in terms to our clients, to our colleagues, to the practice setting in which we work, to other professionals, to the social work profession, and to the broader society. And so if your code of ethics, if your code of conduct contained things more like this, you could certainly input these into the activity instead. But I'm going to focus on those first 6 kind of values that I talked about. And so again, if you want to see it in more depth, right, in what we talk about in our code of ethics, that's there. But that's not necessarily the point of today's conversation. So when I run the activity with students, it takes about 40 to 45 minutes. So it's a decent chunk of the class, but I think that it's a really meaningful way to understand a policy, to understand policy analysis, and to do it in real time. So the first thing is to figure out what policy you're talking about, right? And so for today's example, I'm talking about the Citizenship Act of 2021, which has been proposed. And to convey the message of the policy, you can do it in a couple different ways, right? Some folks like to lecture, so you can just lecture and explain the policy yourself. Alternatively, you could have students read the actual bill, the actual text, right? So this first link here takes us to the federal page that goes through and kind of lists the text of the bill, right? So depending on your students and depending on what class you teach, that might be the most relevant way to do it. And then there's also a couple links here to more mass media sites. So different articles and different videos. So again, depending on what's relevant in the context of your class, you could highlight a specific video that's talking about the impact of this bill on a population, on a geographic area, how it relates to different things, right? There's when a bill, especially a big one like the Citizenship Act, is being proposed, there's a lot of mass media out there. So you can kind of decide what works for you and how you want to convey the content, right? But first, we need to understand what the bill is before we can analyze it. So this is the first part, maybe 10 to 15 minutes. The second part is to really break the students up, to do some group work. And so here, what we want them to be thinking about, first of all, is like, who's impacted by this bill, right? So the Citizenship Act of 2021 obviously is impacting immigrant groups, which is why Rob, Jenny, and myself kind of did this activity together. We all do social work practice with immigrants. That's our area of research. So that's one big group, but it also impacts other groups indirectly, right? So we want to think about here family members, community members, service providers. So all the different professional schools at UMB, right, are all going to be impacted differently by this policy. More medical insurance, right? So that hits our nursing school and our dental school and our school of medicine. Obviously, in legal ways, it hits the law school, right? So there's different ways to think about how this impacts service delivery, how this impacts different professionals. And then, of course, at the community level, right? Wherever we live, whether you live in a more rural area, a more urban area, a more liberal area, a more different conservative area, whatever it is, these things are going to impact our community day in and day out. So here we want students to dive in a little bit beyond just the obvious, but how does this impact different people? And then, students will initially probably have some pros and cons, some things that they like about the bill, some things that they don't. So I engage them just a little bit in some conversation initially. But then I bring them back together and I say, okay, so you had a little bit of a conversation here. Now I want us to analyze it rather than just thinking pros and cons, rather than just thinking on our feet. I want us to dive in and use our code of ethics as that framework, as that lens in how we analyze it. So I give them a couple more instructions here. And so I tell them the next 3 parts, you're going to dive in a little bit deeper. So I want you to go back to the pros and cons that you talked about. And now I want you to analyze it using the code of ethics. So if you said something was a pro, which of those service, dignity and worth of the person, which of those things did it map onto? And how does it connect? How do those two line up or not line up? What's the mismatch? And I want them to kind of think about, as they do that process, how does that bring rigor to an analysis, right? Rather than just saying something's good or bad, what is the idea behind using our code of ethics? How does this strengthen our arguments? How does this replicate it or bring it from just my idea to something more global? And then this third question is really looking at those macro issues, those global issues. So discussing how the policy will impact social work practice, but again, you could think of any school that you're at. How does it impact practice, our service delivery, day in and day out? And that can be, not necessarily just on the one-on-one client, but as a field, as a profession, in terms of insurance, right? All of those different things. And how does it impact different vulnerable groups? So obviously this particular act largely impacts unauthorized immigrants, but there are other groups that will be impacted by different policies. And again, you could choose any policy to go through this activity. This is meant to be something that can be very easily adapted for different folks. And so what I do for them is I give that overview, and then I provide usually 3 or 4 different hyperlinks in the PowerPoint slide that I have, and I put them in the chat box for the students. And I say, here are your Google Slides that you're going to work with in each group. And so before I break them up into groups, they each have a slide deck. And so what I'm showing you, these green slides are green on purpose because this is the slide deck I provide to the students. This is their template that they can go in and type into live in time. So I just copy it, that's a feature in Google Drive. You just copy it. And so I have 3 of them. They go in and they can type in here, group 1, group 2, group 3. And the first slide gives them some instructions. So I'm telling them on each slide, please complete 1 to 3 sentences that explain how the code of ethics could be used to analyze this policy. And so as we'll go through, right, the first one here is service. So it says social workers primary goal is to help people in need and to address social problems. The second one, social justice. Social workers challenge social injustice, right? So there's 6 slides for those 6 principles. And so their instructions on the first one say, for example, on the dignity and worth of the person slide, you could discuss how the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021 is raising the worth of those who are currently in the U.S. unauthorized, as it would provide a pathway to citizenship, which opens doors for employment, inclusion in the community, access to federal benefits, and decreases the pervasive fear that many families face daily. So this is an example, right? And that actually includes 3 examples, if you will, right? Employment, community, federal benefits, and fear. So actually 4 examples. And so they can just dive into one, but I want them to really think about in a full fleshed out thought, how do we connect this policy to dignity and worth of the person? What does that mean? And so at UMBC, we have the undergrad students, and so sometimes they struggle initially with this. And so when I did this the first semester, I'm a first year faculty, so I did this in the fall, and there was some silence, right? And students weren't really sure what to do. So I had to bring them back to the main room, and we talked about it again, and I gave some examples. So when I ran it this semester, I really tried to dive in here and give them a little bit more of a prompt. I want them to critically think. And one of the benefits of Google Slides was that if they were struggling, they could log in and see everybody else's, right? Because when we're critically thinking, it's not answer A, B, or C. It's a way of just thinking about it. It's idea flowing. When you read what someone else wrote, you say, oh, and also this, right? So they were able to kind of go back to that main list that I had given them of all the different groups and really kind of generate some ideas, go beyond, go further, go deeper than what others were sharing. So again, these green slides are what I hand them already ready to go. And so they're in breakout rooms as they are going through these and they're filling in the bullet points. And then I bring them back into the room afterwards, right? And so I ask a couple questions and kind of open it up for a larger discussion. Well, first they do a round robin of kind of sharing out what they talked about. But then we have, more that global conversation. And so, the first, how was the activity? What was harder than others? Was service a hard one to connect to this policy, or was importance of human relationships hard to connect, right? Which ones were harder and easier and why? Which ones were the more obvious connections? So I try to get them thinking about the differences. And also sometimes what we find here is like, well, I just don't really know what service means, right? And so it's encouraging them to go back and to read the Code of Ethics and to understand it, because that's an important feature that we need to know before we graduate. So if you didn't know what it meant, well, this is a good time to go back and revisit. And then secondly, I kind of bring the conversation a little bit more global. So why should social workers be concerned with policy and proposed legislation, right? Like on a real nuts and bolts level, how does policy impact our day-to-day work as social workers? Why, if you're a clinician or a caseworker, why do you care? Why do you need to be active? And so that active piece goes to number 3 here. How can we use these skills? So the skill of tying it to the Code of Ethics when we advocate. And so through my policy course that I teach, right, I teach social welfare policy. That's where I use this activity. I talk a lot about advocacy and how we can advocate as social workers, whether that be for an individual client or whether that be kind of more legislative advocacy at the state level, at the federal level. And so here I give examples around if you were going to call your legislator and talk about something, yeah, you can talk about your own opinion, but if you can also talk about your opinion and how it ties to our Code of Ethics and to what we as social workers a little bit more globally think and feel, sometimes that appeals to people more, right? Each legislator is going to have a different pull. Some want statistics, some want a personal story, some want to tie to something like this. And so it just brings a little bit more rigor, substance to what we're talking about, to how we're analyzing and why we think this is important and something that we want to pass. So I encourage them to think about that a little bit. And then of course I share my own ideas. So in thinking about this activity, why did I choose Google Slides, right? Why is this the right technology? Well, first, it's free. It's easily accessible, right? Students just click a link and it opens and they can access it anonymously. So it says like anonymous giraffe and things like that, right? I don't need to know who's typing in at any time. But I prepare the template for them. And that I think saves a lot of logistical time, especially in the virtual environment. I've found that a lot of students are confused, right? When they get into an activity, or they get there and they're like, okay, well, who's taking notes? Where are we taking notes? Is it in the chat box? Is it on my personal computer? So like I've taken all that mystery out for them. Here's what you're doing. The bullet points are ready to go. Type into the bullet points. As I mentioned before, if a group's struggling, they can open up the other ones. They can look at across the 3 groups and generate ideas and share and dig in. But also with that, I can see all 3 groups. So I have all 3 open on my screen and I know when somebody's struggling because nothing's being typed or nobody's even into the template yet. I can see how many students at the top are in. So it allows me the same management capabilities that I would have in the classroom when I would walk around to different tables, right? And I would hear their conversation. So I can see that, hey, group 2 hasn't typed anything in yet. There's only 2 people in there. And I know that I have 6 students in group 2. So I can bounce to breakout room 2 and I can say, hey, everyone, what's going on? What are the struggles? How can I talk about this? If another group is writing something down that's like totally off tangent, not what I'm looking for, again, I can jump in and I can say, oh, good idea. You started here, but actually I was hoping you would do this, right? And I can talk to them about it so that they're not getting to the end and saying, well, why? That I didn't understand the activity. I did it wrong, right? And so it really allows me as the instructor a lot of ability to be hands-on and to make sure that they're getting what I want out of this activity. And then when they do their little round robin of report outs, it's really easy to report out because they have a slideshow right there, right? We don't even need to manage the screen sharing capability because I can do it for everyone, because that always causes delay of how do I share my screen and oh, my internet's delayed, right? I can manage all that for them because it's Google and it's right there and easy. So I found that this is a really effective platform for doing such an activity. And then the last thing I wanted to kind of talk about here is just thinking about other professional schools, right? Realizing that not all of you are social workers on this screen. And so that I'm not wasting 20 minutes of your time. How and why would you adapt this to your classes, right? Well, many of us have professional code of ethics, code of conducts, right? Most professionals have something like that in your field. And so we can use yours instead of ours. Also thinking about the schools at UMB, right? Largely, we all work with different clients. We all work with, especially in Baltimore City, folks of different socioeconomic statuses, different racial and ethnic backgrounds, whatever it might be. So you can choose a policy that is going to impact your particular field or the groups of people that you see coming through that you want to prepare your students to work with. So really you pick a policy that's going to be a relevant and a dynamic conversation in your area. And then I think the third really important area here is the advocacy piece, which takes a little bit longer, right? If you want to dive into that. But as professionals, by and large, most of us feel some level of interest or obligation, right, to be an advocate for our profession, for our clients, for the people that we serve. And so sometimes we need to prepare students with those advocacy skills. Some might come in having it. For some, it might be second nature. But for some, they don't know who to call. They don't know where to start. They don't know how to write a testimony in a professional manner, whatever it might be. So this activity can really open up that door for either in that same class period or in a future class period to then come back to it and say, hey, remember we talked about this policy thing a couple weeks ago? Well, today we're going to talk about advocacy. How in our professional capacity can we advocate or can we not advocate? Or how do we tie it into our work as a professional and how do we work for changing in policy and bills? So I really try to encourage kind of that conversation there around what do we do next? How do we actually use this in life? So I have about 3 minutes left. So I don't know if anybody wants to unmute with any questions. These were some ideas, but happy to have any questions that folks have or to have some chat in the dialogue box. But basically, if there's any questions or comments, any challenges that you foresee about replicating this, or any challenges that you think students might encounter when participating. And I will say that a good chunk of my students participate on their phones in class. And so folks were able to still do this on a phone. So that's one challenge that doesn't need to be addressed necessarily.